I am Eleanor Vance, a structural engineer, and I believed that marriage, like any great building, was a matter of correct calculation. I believed that if the foundations were solid enough, if the load-bearing walls were properly constructed with discipline and enough love, the whole thing would stand forever. I dedicated 10 years to this belief. 4 years of dating, 6 years of marriage. Today I watched my structure fall. I realized I had been the only architect, the only laborer, and the only inhabitant of the entire house. The shock of finding Alistair with another woman was not explosive. It was strangely quiet. My heart did not race. It simply ceased to beat. The silence in my chest was the most terrifying thing. Yet, I already knew the truth. I had smelled the lie, the deceit, even before the key turned in the lock of his Notting Hill flat in London. I sensed it the moment I saw the unfamiliar flash of color by the entrance. A pair of cheap, bright yellow canvas trainers. They were not Alistair's. They were not mine. I am the woman of muted, practical tones. Navy, charcoal, cream. I never wear yellow. I stopped myself from focusing on the trainers. They could be a friend's, a neighbor's, a harmless visitor. I had to maintain the structure. I am Eleanor Vance. I am logical. I drove 3 hours and 200 miles from Manchester to London for this moment. I had to make it perfect. On the passenger seat of my car, parked on a narrow residential street, was a gift. A specialized, ridiculously expensive prime lens he had talked about for months. Next to it, in a small cardboard box, was his favorite lemon drizzle cake. A cake I had baked myself, carefully, following the recipe to the precise gram, just as I approach any complex structural formula. I loved the ritual of precision. I loved giving him things he loved. I believed that every perfect gift was a brick added to our invincible wall. I slipped the key into the lock. It was an antique lock, always stiff, demanding a specific wrist angle and a slight push inward to cooperate. I had mastered its quirks years ago. As the brass mechanism finally surrendered, with a soft click, I heard it. A faint, low sound of laughter. It was not Alistair's deep, resonant chuckle. It was a light, high-pitched giggle, a sound that belonged to someone much younger, much lighter, and utterly foreign to my world of measured weights and calculations. The jazz music playing softly from inside, an old Miles Davis record he adored, stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. I pushed the door open. The entry hall was small, minimalist, decorated with some of his abstract black and white photographs. My eyes were instantly drawn to a small, brightly patterned silk scarf draped over the console table. It was frivolous, chaotic, and aggressively not mine. I moved forward. The flat was small, open plan. The bedroom door was ajar. I stopped at the frame, standing perfectly still on the threshold. My entire world was condensed into that single, brief frame. Alistair was sitting up in the bed. He was shirtless, his back against the pillows. He was smoking. A cigarette hung loosely between his fingers, smoke curling into the dim, late afternoon light filtering through the linen blinds. The ash fell in lazy flakes towards a half-full glass on the bedside table. The girl was next to him. She was partly covered by the duvet, but she was not completely hidden. She was small, tucked against his side. She was afraid to look at me. All I could see was the messy crown of her bleached blonde hair. The air in the room was thick with the scent of cheap, sweet perfume, a cloying smell that fought against the lingering smell of Alistair's tobacco. Alistair looked up. His eyes, usually warm and brimming with artistic passion, were flat. No panic, no immediate jump to cover his shame. He simply looked at me, Eleanor Vance, his wife of 6 years, standing there in her sensible navy coat and holding a birthday cake, as if I were a delivery person who had interrupted his nap. His voice cut through the silence. It was gravelly, rough from the smoke. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" He didn't say, "My God, Eleanor." He didn't say, "It's not what it looks like." He said, "What are you doing here?" Then, as if that first question wasn't enough, he drove the final nail into my structure. "Why didn't you call?" I felt the sudden, complete erasure of my personality. I was reduced to an inconvenience. I was the structural anomaly, the unexpected force that threatened his carefully managed collapse. He looked annoyed, irritated. It was not the heat of guilt. It was the coldness of being exposed. It was the look of a man who felt entitled to his secrets and resentful of the woman who found them. I didn't cry. My eyes felt dry, like desert sand. The lemon drizzle cake box finally slipped from my numb fingers. It hit the worn, oak floor with a soft, pathetic thud. The sound was swallowed instantly by the vast, silent chasm that had opened between us. I fought for air. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shatter the picture window and let the air, the cold, the truth rush in. But my structural integrity held. My hands, I noticed, were shaking violently. I clenched them behind my back, forcing them to obey the years of training, control, precision, containment. I forced myself to look at him. I looked for a flicker of the man I loved, the one who proposed to me on a cold, rainy day near the Thames, swearing he needed my architectural mind to keep him from floating away. There was nothing, just the chilling indifference of a frozen lake. I found my voice. It felt like tearing brittle silk. Do you know what you're doing, Alistair? The question, the instant it left my lips, sounded ridiculous. Of course, he knew. He was a 35-year-old man, a supposed artist of human stories. He was fully aware. My question wasn't for him. It was a futile cry into the void of my own denial. My gaze shifted to the girl. Alistair's lack of fear seemed to give her courage. Slowly, tentatively, she raised her head from the pillow. She met my eyes. She was young, barely 22, with wide, terrified, beautiful eyes. I saw it all in that single look. This was not a one-night mistake. This was a pattern. This was a new habit. A new life he had been building, silently, next to the one I was still desperately trying to maintain. "What is your name?" I asked her. My voice was surprisingly steady. Before she could answer, Alistair's hand shot out, not in aggression, but in a weary paternal gesture. He pulled the duvet higher around her neck. A protector. He was protecting her from me, the intruder. "Eleanor, that's enough. Leave her out of this," he said, his voice dropping an octave, trying to summon an authority he no longer possessed. I didn't argue. I didn't need the girl's name. She was just another detail, a bright, chaotic ornament on the exterior of his secret life. My focus narrowed back to him. The betrayal was complete, but the realization was deeper. I had been betrayed by the assumption that he wanted the same structure I did. I had been betrayed by my own relentless hope. I looked down at the floor briefly, at the crushed cardboard box. The lemon drizzle cake was probably ruined, a perfect structure, smashed by a moment of unexpected reality. I turned. I walked out of the room. I did not run. I walked. Every step was deliberate, measured. A structural engineer does not run from a failure. She documents it. I crossed the small living room, the space where we had shared Christmases and future plans. I reached the front door. My fingers found the cold brass handle. I paused, my hand hovering over the lock mechanism, the one I had mastered. I didn't need to look back to know he was still sitting there, silent, perhaps already lighting another cigarette, relieved that the uncomfortable moment was over. "I'm not coming back, Alistair," I said, not loudly, but with the cold, absolute certainty of a demolition clause. "You can keep the flat, and the lens. I will have the solicitor send the papers." I waited for a reaction, a protest, a shred of the old Alistair. He said nothing, only the sound of the springs creaking on the old bed when he shifted his weight. I walked out of the apartment and into the late London afternoon. The air was damp and cold. I did not look at the yellow trainers. I did not look at the car where the expensive new camera lens sat waiting. I only walked. The 200 miles back to Manchester seemed insignificant. The collapse had already happened inside me. The drive was just the physical transit of the wreckage. My marriage was gone. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, chilling question, "Why didn't you call?" I was on the M40 motorway, heading north. I had left London's Notting Hill behind, but the air inside the car still felt heavy, with the sweet, cloying scent of that cheap perfume. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't dare turn on the heating. Despite the damp October air seeping in, I needed the cold. I needed the sharpness of the physical discomfort to anchor me, to keep me from floating into a void of pure, debilitating numbness. My mind, the mind of a structural engineer, was already at work, not grieving, but running failure analysis. Why did this bridge collapse? Where was the weakest point? I was reviewing the blueprints of our 10 years together, searching for the micro fissures I had deliberately ignored. 4 years ago, before we were married, Alistair had received a major commission, a documentary series about abandoned industrial sites across the north of England. He was ecstatic, full of purpose. I remember standing with him on the roof of a derelict mill in Leeds, the wind whipping his hair, his face alight with passion. He turned to me and said, "Eleanor, promise me you'll never let me stop chasing this light." I took his hand, tracing the lines of his knuckles, and promised. I saw that moment as a foundation block, a mutual commitment to his dream. Now, on the motorway, the memory tasted like ash. I hadn't been supporting his dream. I had been providing the safety net, the financial and emotional infrastructure that allowed him to be irresponsible. I had maintained the Manchester home, the joint accounts, the stable career at the firm, all while he chased the light, which, apparently, sometimes included a 22-year-old student named Chloe. I had deduced her name from a discarded art school badge on his desk. A flash of memory, our wedding day, 6 years ago, at a small, elegant registry office. He was late, of course. Exactly 12 minutes late, claiming traffic drama on the way from a last-minute shoot. My mother, Martha, had squeezed my hand, her eyes worried. I had simply smiled and rationalized. That's Alistair. The price of genius is flexibility, Mum. I had accepted the chaos as part of the package. I had built my structure around his unpredictability, reinforcing the parts that needed him the most. Now I saw the truth. His lateness was not charming artistic flair. It was a fundamental lack of respect for my time, my structure, my commitment. The road stretched out, gray and relentless. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The logic part of my brain, the part that dealt in finite element analysis and stress ratios, was screaming. Failure was predictable. Element A, the distance, 200 miles. It was our compromise. My stable, high-paying engineering job was in Manchester. His artistic network was in London. We decided he would keep the London flat for shoots and come back to our Manchester home every fortnight. That quickly became every 3 weeks, then once a month. I always told him, distance is nothing when the intention is fixed. I had believed that. I believed our intention was fixed. I was wrong. The distance wasn't the cause of the failure. It was the symptom of a withdrawal I was too proud or too terrified to acknowledge. Element B, the money. I was always the financially responsible one. I managed our mortgage, his equipment costs, his health insurance. He was brilliant, but terrible with paperwork. I considered it my role, the pragmatic engineer supporting the visionary artist. Now, I remembered the sudden sharp spike in his credit card activity 2 months ago. A large sum spent at a high-end vintage clothing boutique in Shoreditch. I hadn't questioned it. I'd simply categorized it as artistic research. My structural oversight was not protective. It was blinding. The pain finally started, not as a sharp, sudden crack, but as a dull, immense pressure. It was the pain of a slow, sustained load that the structure was never meant to bear. It felt like my entire rib cage was contracting, squeezing the air from my lungs. I pulled over into a rest area near Oxford, the neon lights of a petrol station glaring against the twilight. I needed to breathe. I got out of the car, the cold air hitting my face. I walked towards a small, quiet patch of grass behind the lorry park. I stood there, shivering, looking at the distant headlights streaming down the motorway. I tried to cry. I wanted the release, the cleansing flood of grief. But nothing came. My emotional floodgates were engineered to hold, too strong for the torrent. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I didn't call Alistair. I pulled up the schematics for my current project, the revitalization of the historic Trafford Power Station into a mixed-use cultural hub. It was a masterpiece of Victorian brickwork and early 20th century steel, a beautiful, daunting beast of a building. I had spent 6 months calculating how to stabilize the crumbling façade while integrating modern steel frames inside. I stared at the screen, at the clean lines of my drawings, the perfect geometry, and then I saw it, the terrifying, blinding irony. I was agonizing over the stability of a century-old brick structure, meticulously calculating its vulnerabilities, while my own foundation was being systematically dismantled, piece by invisible piece, 200 miles away. I, the expert in structural integrity, had failed the most basic inspection of my own life. I went back to the car. The lemon drizzle cake box was still lying on the floor. I knelt down and picked it up. The box was slightly dented, but the cake inside seemed intact. It was the perfect metaphor. The external damage was minimal, but the integrity of the core, the sweetness, the intention, was compromised by the dirt and the fall. I placed the box gently on the back seat. I couldn't throw it away. I couldn't eat it. It was evidence. I started driving again. My focus shifted from Alistair's betrayal to my own complicity. That was the real, devastating revelation. I had not been deceived. I had been complicit in the deception, by choosing to wear the blindfold. I had mistaken his childish dependence for genuine need. I had mistaken my control for love. I had needed to be the strong one, the fixer, the engineer. I needed the structure of our marriage to hold so I could prove that my life, unlike my mother's, was sound. My mother, Martha. The thought of her brought a fresh wave of coldness, but this time it was laced with a strange, dark understanding. Martha had been through a betrayal with my father, David, a quiet, long-term emotional affair with a colleague. My father was a gentle, artistic soul, much like Alistair, prone to grand, beautiful pronouncements and zero follow-through. Martha never screamed. She never confronted. She simply contained the damage, built a wall of silence around the wound, and continued to function as a perfect wife and mother. She protected the family structure at the cost of her own soul. I, Eleanor, the pragmatic engineer, had watched that silent, slow erosion. I swore I would never be like her. I swore I would choose strength. Yet, here I was, mirroring her in the fundamental choice. The choice to ignore the signs. The choice to prioritize the appearance of stability over the reality of happiness. The message I had received from my childhood was not betrayal hurts, but disruption is worse. And so, I had become the anti-disruption machine. Alistair's voice echoed in my head. The final, chilling question. Why didn't you call? He didn't ask where I was. He didn't ask how I was. He asked why I violated the unspoken rule of his double life. That question was the final demolition order. It meant he didn't view me as his wife. He viewed me as a surveillance system that should have given him a security alert before approaching. I drove the final hour in a haze of focused anger. Not at him, but at the narrative I had built for myself. I had constructed a fortress of discipline and order, and I had invited a ghost into it. And the ghost, Alistair, simply walked through the walls I thought were made of steel. They were just paper. When I finally reached my semi-detached home in South Manchester, the house we bought together and I paid for, it was completely dark. It was my sanctuary, my perfectly organized base of operations. The drive was over, the wreckage transported. Now, the real work began. The salvage, the disposal, the terrifying process of building something new from zero-point energy. I stood on the driveway, feeling the cold rain start to fall, and whispered the truth to the silent, dark house. The structural integrity of my life is at zero. I stood in the driveway, the cold rain of Manchester finally breaking the silence that had encased me since London. I didn't rush inside. I just stared at the house. It was a perfect, Victorian semi-detached. The brickwork restored to its original, proud red. I had personally supervised the renovation 2 years ago, down to the last millimeter of the mortar joints. I knew every structural stress point, every joist, every hidden pipe. This house was the tangible manifestation of my logic and control. Yet, as I looked at it now, it felt like an empty, elaborate stage set for a play that had just been cancelled. I finally used my key and stepped into the flawless silence of the hallway. Everything was in its place. The polished wooden floor shone under the soft spotlight I had insisted on for the entrance. Alistair's Wellington boots, usually muddy, were nowhere to be seen, because of course, he hadn't been here in weeks. The absence of his familiar mess was louder than any chaos could have been. The house was not merely empty, it was meticulously maintained for an inhabitant who never arrived. I didn't take off my coat. I walked straight to the back of the house, to the study I had converted into a design studio. This was my sanctuary, a room dominated by my large drafting table and the immense, complex three-dimensional model of the Trafford Power Station revitalization project. It stood in the center of the room, a miniature world of steel, glass, and concrete. I sat down heavily in my ergonomic chair. My body was still running on the adrenaline of the London encounter and the cold fury of the drive. I was a machine that had just completed an emergency shutdown, and the cooling process was agonizingly slow. I stared at the model. The structure was perfect. I touched the tiny, perfectly aligned steel beams I had glued together. This geometry was reliable. It was honest. Steel would bear the load calculated. Brick would support the weight prescribed. The humans, I now understood, were not bound by the same laws of physics. My phone, which I had silenced hours ago, began to vibrate on the desk. I flinched. It was a text message, not a call. Of course not. Alistair never chose a communication method that required immediate emotional confrontation. I picked it up. The screen glowed, illuminating my face in the dark room. Alistair, look, Ellie, I know this looks bad. We need to talk this through. It's complicated, not what you think. I'm taking the first train up tomorrow. Don't do anything rash, please. I read the words twice. I know this looks bad. The casual understatement was staggering. It wasn't a confession. It was a weather report. It's complicated, not what you think. The classic deflection, blaming the ambiguity of reality instead of his own actions. And the final, infuriating command. Don't do anything rash, please. He wasn't worried about my heart. He was worried about the joint assets. He was worried about the structure he relied on, the foundation I provided. Rage finally breached my emotional containment. It wasn't a hot, blinding fire, but a cold, crystalline anger. The kind of anger that fuels calculation, not chaos. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The kitchen was my favorite room. Minimalist, stainless steel, impeccably clean. The very embodiment of my life philosophy. I opened the refrigerator. There, sitting precisely in the center of the middle shelf, was a sealed container of organic Greek yogurt, labeled neatly with the expiration date and Alistair's. I was the one who meticulously labeled and portioned everything. He would never touch anything not clearly marked as his. Another small, hidden contract of our cohabitation. I grabbed the container. I walked back to the study. I stood over the power station model. It was a magnificent structure, a testament to my skill. I opened the yogurt container. I didn't throw it. I simply tilted it slowly over the model. The thick, white yogurt, Alistair's favorite, dripped slowly onto the miniature building. It coated the perfectly aligned steel beams, filled the ventilation shafts, and pooled around the base of the delicate brick façade. It ruined the geometry. It made the entire structure sticky, dirty, and fundamentally unsound. It was the physical manifestation of how he had soiled the beautiful, precise blueprint of our shared life. The white, opaque sludge hid the complexity and dedication beneath. I stood there, breathing heavily, watching the ruin, and I realized my marriage hadn't collapsed suddenly. It had been like this model for months. A perfect exterior, hiding the slow, corrosive damage from within, damage I had allowed by not conducting a proper inspection. I started pacing the room. My engineer's mind needed a clear path, a defined procedure for the catastrophe. My past, the shadow of my mother's silent suffering, intruded again. Martha had kept the divorce a secret for nearly a decade, living in the same house with David, exchanging polite words, until I was safely at university. She believed she had protected me from the trauma of the split. But what she really taught me was that betrayal is to be endured, not confronted. I picked up the phone again, not to reply to Alistair, but to call the only other person who truly understood the fragility beneath the surface. My closest friend, Sarah, a solicitor in Leeds. It happened, I whispered. The first words I had spoken that weren't commands or cold statements. Sarah didn't ask what. She knew. She had been the one watching the escalating signs I refused to see. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice calm and steady, like a good supporting pillar. I walked out. I told him I was sending the papers. He texted me. "He's coming up tomorrow to talk." "Don't let him in, Ellie," Sarah commanded. "Don't let him charm you. Don't let him rationalize. And absolutely do not let him use the word complicated. The only complicated thing here is the division of assets, which I will handle. His actions are brutally simple." I looked at the model, dripping yogurt onto the hardwood floor. Simple. She was right. The problem was never the architecture of our marriage, but the materials he used: lies, indifference, and a lack of moral, tensile strength. I spent the rest of the night meticulously documenting everything, not for a lawyer, but for my own peace of mind. I opened a new file on my laptop. Failure analysis, the Vance Thorne structure. I logged the date of the discovery, the physical evidence, the yellow trainers, the perfume, his text message, and the financial irregularities, the large transfer to Chloe, which I discovered after a deeper dive into our shared bank statement. The financial betrayal was the real structural failure. See, Alistair was not just cheating on me emotionally, he was systematically draining our shared resources to finance his secondary life. The money was not artistic research. It was a deliberate, calculating act of financial abuse hidden behind his artistic chaos. This wasn't the sweet, irresponsible dreamer I married. This was a thief. As dawn broke, casting a pale, grey light over the Manchester skyline, I stood at the window, staring out. I had not slept. I had not cried. But I had mapped the wreckage. I had taken control of the narrative. Alistair was due to arrive later that morning. He expected a weeping wife, an emotional battlefield where he could play the remorseful victim and negotiate a soft landing. He would find no such battlefield. He would find only the engineer who had signed the demolition order. I deleted Alistair's text message from my phone. I didn't need the evidence. The evidence was etched into the ruined model, and the cold certainty in my heart. The game of silence, the game my mother taught me to play, was over. I was ready to speak. The train from London was due to arrive at Manchester Piccadilly at 11:15. Alistair would then take a taxi directly to the house. I knew his itinerary better than he did. I knew the timetable, the exact fare, and the route. I, the engineer, had always been the navigator of his life. But today, I was setting the boundaries of a perimeter I had designed solely for him. I changed the locks at 10 o'clock. It was a precise, clinical operation. I had purchased a high-security replacement cylinder the night before, choosing a brand that prioritized tamper-proof design. The old lock, the one our keys shared, was now a defunct piece of brass sitting on my workbench. Another relic of a failed structure. The metallic click of the new lock, engaging, felt like the closing of a vault door, sealing off the chaos outside and protecting the fragile, new quiet within. At 11:45, the taxi pulled up to the curb. I watched from the upper window of my study, the one overlooking the front garden. Alistair stepped out, looking exactly as he always did. Handsome, artfully disheveled, wearing his favorite tailored coat, which I had bought him, and carrying a small, worn leather duffel bag. He looked like a man returning from a successful shoot, not a man arriving to confess a monumental failure. He paused on the pavement, looking up at the house, perhaps expecting to see my face crumpled in tears, ready for his performance of remorse. He walked up the front path and inserted his key into the old lock. Nothing happened. He tried again, a little harder, then turned the key with increasing frustration. The sound was a dull, defeated scratching noise that brought a cold, professional satisfaction to my core. The old structure was officially impenetrable. He stepped back and looked up at the house again. I remained hidden in the shadow of the curtain. He pulled out his phone and called. I let it ring. The sound was a frantic, desperate pulse in the quiet house, but I let it die. He tried again. Still, I didn't answer. He eventually sent a text. Alistair. Ellie, what the hell are you doing? I'm standing outside. Let me in. We need to talk this through face to face. I walked across the room to the intercom on the wall by the entrance. I pressed the talk button, my voice level, stripped of all emotion. It sounded amplified and distant, a voice from a broadcast, not a conversation. Alistair, you can leave your bag on the step. Sarah, my solicitor, will be in touch with the formal separation papers by the end of the day. There is nothing to talk about, face to face or otherwise. His voice crackled, distorted by the poor quality intercom speaker. He sounded startled, completely thrown off his prepared script. Eleanor, don't be ridiculous. This is insane. Are you actually going to do this over the intercom? What are you, some kind of robot? Let me in right now. I am a structural engineer, Alistair, and the foundation is gone. There is no longer any structure to support. I am not being ridiculous. I am being logical. You are a trespasser. Leave the premises immediately. Trespasser? This is my house. You can't do this, Ellie. You can't just shut down 6 years of marriage like a faulty machine. What about what we built? What about the good times? His voice was rising now, shifting from annoyance to a desperate theatrical plea. What we built, I repeated, the phrase hanging in the air. I built. You only occupied the space. And the good times were bought with the stability I provided, stability you secretly despised. Now you have 30 seconds to leave, or I will call the police for harassment. The line went silent. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, feeling the immense, crushing weight of that moment, and I didn't enjoy the power, but I recognized its necessity. This was the only way to break the cycle of passive submission my mother had passed down. Finally, I heard his footsteps crunching on the gravel. He cursed loudly, a vulgar sound that always felt out of place coming from him. Then, the sound of the taxi door slamming shut. The engine roared, and the street was quiet again. The physical threat was gone. The internal wreckage, however, remained. The confrontation, while brief, served as a painful, final confirmation. His immediate reaction was not guilt for the betrayal, but indignation at the disruption of his convenience. His first thought was of the house, of his access, of his rights. He had expected an emotional wreck he could easily manipulate. He found a locked fortress. I spent the rest of the day in my study, the Trafford power station model still sticky with yogurt, forcing myself to confront the silent fissures, the cracks in my own perception that allowed the failure to propagate. I created a new section in my failure analysis log. Element C, self-deception and the inheritance of silence. The first fissure, the acceptance of distance as freedom. Alistair always described the 200 miles between us as space for creativity, insisting that proximity stifled his artistic process. I, wanting to be the non-controlling modern wife, embraced this. In reality, I was enabling his double life. The distance was not space. It was a buffer, a vast, engineered void that prevented me from seeing the truth. I had chosen to admire the distant, glowing façade of the artist, rather than inspect the rot in the structure beneath my feet. The second fissure, the need to be indispensable. I had allowed, even encouraged his financial incompetence. I handled the tax returns, the bills, the insurance, the investment accounts. I believed that his reliance on my practicality was his form of affection. It made me feel strong, the solid anchor keeping his kite from drifting away. The truth was harsher. I had created a parental dynamic, where I was the responsible, silent mother, and he was the charming, irresponsible child. I confused being needed with being loved. This codependency was my mother's legacy. The silent contract of the betrayed wife. If I make myself essential, he will not leave. Alistair simply found someone else to be charming to while maintaining my financial services. The third fissure, the denial of affection. Over the past year, physical intimacy had faded to near non-existence. His excuses were always plausible. Late nights editing, stress from a deadline, the exhaustion of the journey. I, ever the understanding engineer, rationalized it as the price of his success. I substituted physical connection with administrative perfection. A clean house, a stocked fridge, a flawlessly executed project at the firm. I had accepted the absence of warmth in exchange for the presence of order. This was the ultimate inheritance from Martha, sacrificing personal happiness for the maintenance of a dignified, functional appearance. The depth of my denial was a cavern. It was not just one small sign. It was a decade of neon warning lights I had willfully misinterpreted as decorative. I had to physically remove the memory, the evidence of his presence. I began the demolition of his objects. I went into the living room, a space dominated by his vast collection of photography books, volumes heavy with the work of Ansel Adams, Cartier-Bresson, and Diane Arbus. These books were his identity, the physical props of his artistic mystique. I lifted the first heavy volume, feeling the weight of the paper and binding. It felt suddenly foreign, meaningless. I carried the books in stacks to the garage, stacking them neatly next to his unused mountaineering equipment, another expensive hobby I had paid for and he quickly abandoned. I did not fling them, or rage. I handled them with the clinical detachment of a demolition crew cataloging recoverable materials. Next was the wardrobe, the expensive shirts, the tailored trousers, the wool jumpers, all clothes I had chosen, paid for, and ironed. As I folded them, I remembered the countless mornings I had prepared his clothes for his London trips, my hands tracing the outline of his shoulders, thinking, I'm taking care of him. Now, I saw it as a ritual of self-abasement. I packed them into large, black plastic sacks. These bags were not for him. They were barriers. They contained the toxic residue of my self-deception. I found a photograph tucked away in the back of a drawer. A picture of us, from 5 years ago, standing on a beach in Cornwall. We were smiling, arms around each other. The sun was golden. It was a perfect manufactured moment of happiness. I looked at the Eleanor in the photo. Her eyes were bright, yes, but her smile was tight, already holding too much in reserve. And she looked like a woman who was already anticipating the next structural weakness. I didn't tear the photograph. I simply placed it face down on the desk, treating it as a contaminated object. I couldn't destroy the past, but I could neutralize its power over the present. The kitchen, my pristine kitchen, also required remediation. I packed away his favorite coffee mugs, the French press I had bought him, and the expensive whiskey glasses we used only when his London friends visited. Each item was a tiny, jagged splinter of the life I had adored, but he had discarded. By nightfall, the house felt subtly altered. It was emptier, colder, but finally, authentically mine. The air was cleaner, free of the ghost of his projected presence. I sat down to eat a simple dinner, pasta with pesto, at the kitchen island. I ate slowly, tasting the food properly for the first time in days. My hands were steady. My thoughts were linear. The structure was gone, but the engineer survived. The final log entry for the day was made in my failure analysis file. Alistair Thorne has been successfully excluded from the primary structure. Emotional contamination is being managed. Commencing internal reconstruction phase. The inheritance of silence is terminated. I closed the laptop. The quiet of the house was now my ally, not my enemy. It was the sound of my own independence. A sound Martha, my mother, had never quite managed to hear until it was too late. I would not make her mistake. The cycle ends now. The second day after the exclusion was not about cleaning Alistair's presence. It was about excavating my own past. The silence in the house, now complete and absolute, forced me to listen, not to what was, but to what had always been. I was driven by a need for intellectual consistency. I couldn't understand my own catastrophic oversight, my willingness to rationalize and enable Alistair's slow-motion abandonment without understanding the source code of my fear. My memory of my mother, Martha, was a carefully constructed image of resilience. She was the stoic woman who continued to bake on Sundays, who maintained a perfect garden, who ensured that my father, David, despite his emotional distance, remained a presence in my life until I left home. She had protected the family structure. That, I believed, was strength. Now, I began to see it as a terrifying form of self-immolation. I went up to the small, rarely accessed attic space above the master bedroom. It was a repository of forgotten things, old university notes, childhood drawings, and sealed boxes marked Martha, pre-2005. My mother had moved most of her possessions out after the final, quiet divorce settlement, years after the actual split, but she had left a few remnants, things too painful or too innocuous to pack. I found a small, dusty cedar chest tucked beneath a moth-eaten blanket. Inside, among a bundle of faded childhood letters I had written her, lay a slender, brown, leather-bound book. It was a diary. The first page was dated nearly 25 years ago. I recognized Martha's elegant, precise handwriting. The handwriting of a woman who valued order and containment above all else. I pulled it out, the leather smooth and cool under my fingertips. I sat on the attic floor, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from the small window. I opened the book and began to read. It was not a flowery account of dreams or hopes. It was a logbook, a detailed, chronological record of my father David's emotional withdrawal and intermittent physical absences. September 12th, 1999. David was late again, said he was lost in the creative process. The scent of lavender on his shirt was not the scent of my laundry detergent. I pretended not to notice. Eleanor is preparing for her school debate. I must maintain the peace. The structure must hold for her. November 3rd, 2000. Found a receipt for 2 theater tickets in his jacket pocket. We did not go to the theater, I did not ask. Asked him instead about Eleanor's piano lesson schedule. He was immediately relieved and praised my organization. My silence is his release. I am trading my truth for his presence. May 17th, 2001. The silence between us now is its own physical entity. It is thicker than the walls, heavier than the roof. It is what holds the house together. I am trapped inside the structure of my own silence. I told myself I am doing this for Eleanor, so she doesn't experience the chaos of separation. But perhaps I am doing it because I am terrified of the chaos of freedom. I felt a cold shiver trace its way down my spine. The words were a mirror, reflecting my own thoughts, my own actions, my attempt to control Alistair's life, my fierce focus on organization and perfection, my denial of the distance. It was all copied directly from Martha's blueprint, and I had inherited not just her fear of chaos, but her method of coping. Silence as a shield, order as a substitute for affection. I saw the devastating cost of her choice. She had spent a decade living next to a ghost, sacrificing her happiness to preserve a façade for my sake. But the façade didn't protect me. It infected me. It taught me that betrayal wasn't the worst outcome. The worst outcome was the collapse of the image of success. The worst outcome was disruption. The most chilling entry was near the end of the book, dated just before I left for university. October 2nd, 2005. Eleanor is gone. The structure is empty. I realize now that the only person I was protecting was myself from the shame of failure. David is not here tonight. I will make tea, and I will continue to be silent, because after all these years, I no longer know how to speak the truth. The diary ended there. No grand confrontation, no resolution, just silence, stretching into the void. My mother had not found strength. She had found resignation, and that resignation had been quietly transferred to me, her only daughter, like a defective gene. I had married Alistair, the artistic, unpredictable, charming man, precisely because he was the embodiment of the chaos I was trying to control. A twisted attempt to resolve my parents' tragedy through perfect, disciplined love. I closed the diary, my hands shaking not from fear, but from a fierce, cleansing clarity. I had to break the cycle. I had to speak the truth. My mother could not. I stood up, leaving the diary on the dusty floor. I walked downstairs and called Martha. She lived in a small seaside town in Dorset now. A quiet, orderly life she had finally constructed for herself. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm and familiar. "Ellie, darling, I was just about to call you. I heard from your father. He ran into Alistair in London. They had a coffee. Is everything all right? You haven't been yourself lately." The lie in her voice, the immediate protective deflection, was stunning. David was long divorced from her, yet she still maintained the fiction of their casual contact. And her mention of Alistair was clearly a fishing expedition, a subtle attempt to assess the damage without asking directly. "Mother, I filed for divorce this morning," I stated, my voice low and steady. I watched my reflection in the window. I was pale, but my eyes were clear. A pause, a long, unnatural silence, stretched across the 200 miles between us. I heard her sharp intake of breath, the noise of a woman trying to regain control before the mask slipped. "Oh, Eleanor, I'm so sorry, darling. Did he finally just leave?" she asked, the question itself already making excuses for him. "He didn't leave. I found him in his London flat with another woman, barely 22, and I locked him out of the house yesterday when he arrived in Manchester." "You locked him out?" Martha sounded genuinely shocked, not by the infidelity, but by the aggressive, unambiguous action. It was a violation of the Martha Code, the code of dignified suffering. "Yes, I locked him out. Mother, why didn't you ever tell me the truth about Dad? Why did you make me think that silence was the only way to survive betrayal?" My voice broke slightly, but I forced it back to steel. She started to cry. A soft, muffled, desolate sound I hadn't heard since I was a small child. "Eleanor, I did it for you. I wanted you to have stability. I wanted you to trust the home. I thought if I held the structure, the pain would be contained." "It wasn't contained, Mother. It was transferred. I spent 10 years with Alistair trying to prove that your marriage was the exception, that my marriage could be fixed by perfect administration. I built my life around his neediness, just like you built yours around Dad's chaos. I chose a man who was emotionally and financially dependent, so I could control the variables. I confused being a fixer with being a partner." I stopped, taking a deep, shuddering breath. I was terrified of the collapse because I was terrified of being you. "Oh, Ellie," she whispered, the raw honesty of her pain finally coming through. "It's not the betrayal that breaks you. It's realizing you ignored every sign. I was so angry at your father, but I was furious at myself for seeing the truth and choosing to stay quiet. I chose the shame of silence over the dignity of confrontation, and I never wanted that shame for you." Her words hit me like a powerful stress test, painful but necessary to reveal the true tensile strength of the structure. She finally admitted it. It was about shame, not strength. "I found your diary, Mother, the one from before 2005. I know you documented everything. You knew the structure was failing long before you let it fall." Another silence. And this one felt different, not of denial, but of shared, brutal understanding. "Then you know the full truth," Martha finally said, her voice dry now. "I am proud of you, Eleanor. Proud that you found the strength to speak, to lock the door. That is the one thing I could never teach you by example. You have stopped the cycle. Don't ever look back." The conversation ended with a quiet affirmation, not a goodbye. I had finally confronted the ghost of my mother's past, and by doing so, I had exorcised the silence that had infected my present. I put the phone down, feeling lighter, as if a decade of accumulated emotional weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The failure analysis was complete. The damage was known. The path to reconstruction was clear. I walked back up to the attic. I picked up Martha's diary. I brought it downstairs and placed it on my study desk, right next to the still gooey model of the power station. The diary was no longer a symbol of my fear. It was a blueprint of what not to build. The lesson was etched in its final pages. The betrayal was his, but the consequence of the silence was mine. And the silence had just been broken. The conversation with my mother had done more than just lift the burden of silence. It had sharpened my focus. The emotional wreckage was documented, the heritage of fear acknowledged. Now, I could concentrate on the practical geometry of the divorce, which, in my world, meant the ruthless pursuit of numerical truth. The financial documents, which I had always managed meticulously, were no longer symbols of my duty. They were the final, irrefutable proof of Alistair's calculated deceit. I spent the morning in my study, a mug of strong black coffee growing cold beside me. I was logged into the joint accounts. My structural engineering firm paid me exceptionally well. Alistair's freelance income, though respectable when commissions were successful, was sporadic. I was the financial, load-bearing wall of our relationship. I had always shielded him from the stress of budgeting, categorizing his withdrawals as equipment, travel, or creative expenditure. I pulled up the last 3 months of transactions. The large, suspicious transfer I had noted briefly during my initial shock the first night now demanded a forensic inspection. It was a single transfer made 6 weeks ago for £3,000, a substantial sum, not typical for his small-scale expenses. The recipient was listed simply as C. Davies, rent. I didn't need the art school badge I had seen on his desk to connect the dots. C. Davies was Chloe. This wasn't a casual fling. This was subsidized living. The revelation was a hammer blow, but it didn't hurt in the same way the infidelity had. The infidelity was a violation of intimacy. The financial deceit was a violation of my labor, my competence, and my inherent belief in fairness. He hadn't just broken a vow. He had stolen the value of my work, using my meticulous organization against me. He was financing his escape, his new unencumbered life with a younger woman, using the very stability I had painstakingly provided. This was the true structural failure. He wasn't just weak, he was parasitic. The anger was immense, a towering internal pressure that required immediate release through action. I immediately called Sarah, my solicitor friend in Leeds. It was time to formalize the demolition. Sarah, I need you to file an emergency motion for the immediate freezing of all joint liquid assets, I stated, skipping the pleasantries. My voice was tight, clinical, and devoid of any emotional tremor. Ellie, I thought we were moving toward mediation for the first phase, Sarah said, her voice dropping into her professional, cautious tone. Mediation is for people who negotiated in good faith. Alistair is not one of those people. 6 weeks ago, he transferred £3,000 from our shared savings account to the student he was having an affair with, under the pretense of emergency rent. That money was part of the principal I put down on the house. He is financially compromising the structure of the separation before the papers are even signed. I have the bank statements. I need the money secured now. Sarah's response was immediate and sharp. Understood. That changes the entire landscape. That's not just infidelity. That's dissipation of marital assets and a breach of fiduciary duty. It frames him as willfully deceptive. This allows us to move aggressively, Ellie. We will file the motion this afternoon. Are you certain about this path? Once we go down the aggressive route, there's no turning back to friendly arbitration. I'm an engineer, Sarah. Once the failure mode is identified, you proceed with the most rigorous countermeasure. His action was simple, predatory, and calculated. My response will be equally simple, legally sound, and absolute. You freeze the accounts, every last penny. I ended the call, the phone slipping from my damp hand. My entire body was vibrating with a controlled, tense energy. I had confronted the emotional legacy of my mother's silence, and now I was confronting the financial legacy of his betrayal. The message I was sending was clear. I am not my mother. I will not suffer in silence, and I will not allow my labor to be stolen. My eyes fell on my drafting table. Tucked into the corner, beneath a stack of building codes, was a roll of thick vellum paper tied with a blue ribbon. It was the complete set of architectural drawings for the dream house we were planning to build in the Cotswolds. A beautiful modernist, glass and wood structure nestled into the countryside. I had spent countless nights designing it over the last year, pouring my technical skill and all my remaining romantic hope into its blueprint. It was to be the ultimate proof of our stability, the unbreakable, self-sustaining structure of our future. I pulled the drawings out. The vellum felt cool and heavy. I unrolled them across the length of the study floor. It was a gorgeous, detailed design, a three-dimensional representation of my shattered future. The clean, elegant lines of the floor plan, the complex calculations for the cantilevered roof, the precise location of the massive, sun-drenched photography studio I had designed just for him. Every line I had drawn was a lie I had told myself. I fetched the utility knife from my tool chest, the one I used to precisely cut materials for my scale models. It was sharp, surgical, and designed for clean separation. I stood over the sprawling blueprint. I started cutting. I didn't slash wildly in a fit of rage. I cut precisely. I started with the line that demarcated the main living space from the master bedroom. Separation. Then, I cut through the foundation plan, severing the link between the main house and the photography studio. Exclusion. I continued, tracing every load-bearing wall, every meticulously placed window, severing the lines with steady, measured precision. The sound of the sharp blade slicing through the heavy paper was a crisp, satisfying shh-ick, a sound that spoke of finality. I cut the entire blueprint into hundreds of small, rectangular fragments. They were neat, geometric pieces, each one a perfect, discarded module of our impossible future. The act was not emotional destruction, it was professional deconstruction. I was formally terminating the project. The project code, the future, the shared structure, all were now reduced to recyclable waste. I swept the pieces into a large cardboard box. I walked out to the industrial bin near the curb, the same bin where I had discarded my wedding ring the previous day. I lifted the lid and dumped the contents of the box. The fragments of our dream house fluttered down onto the trash, settling amongst the packaging and debris. It was over. The physical manifestation of the lie was gone. I walked back inside, feeling the immense, crushing solitude of my act. The house felt cavernous now, but that solitude was also a definition of freedom. I had finally completed the demolition phase. The cycle of inherited silence was broken, not just through words to my mother, but through irreversible actions. The locked door, the frozen accounts, the shredded dream. Later that evening, Alistair called again. This time, he didn't text. He was clearly desperate, realizing the gravity of the locked door and the lawyer's sudden involvement. I let it go to voicemail. His message was raw, angry, and finally, afraid. Eleanor, what the hell is Sarah doing? My accounts are locked. I can't access the business fund. This is retaliation. Ellie, pure spite. You're destroying my career. Don't you dare do this to me. You're acting like a stranger. Call me back, right now. You're overreacting and you know it. This is insane. Just talk to me. I listened to the message twice. His fear was music. It was the sound of a parasite realizing the host had cut off the blood supply. He didn't mention Chloe. He didn't mention the 3,000 pounds. He only mentioned his career and his convenience. He hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was my ability to see him clearly and act decisively. I saved the voicemail message. It was perfect evidence of his continued self-absorption and his attempt to gaslight my reaction as overreacting and spite. I forwarded the audio file immediately to Sarah. The file name was simple: Evidence, Confirmation of Narcissistic Collapse. I looked around the quiet, clean, empty house. The silence was now protective. I felt the profound, aching relief of a woman who had finally stopped carrying the weight of two people. My structure was zero, but zero was a starting point. It was pure potential. I was ready for the rebuild. The finality of the previous day's actions, the freezing of the accounts, the shredding of the blueprints, the sound of Alistair's terrified, impotent rage on the voicemail had not brought peace, but a cold, intense clarity. If the structure of her personal life was at zero, the structure of her professional life demanded a corresponding intensity. She needed a new load-bearing wall, and she decided it would be the concrete and steel of her career. Eleanor arrived at the offices of Vanguard Structural, her engineering firm in the heart of Manchester, earlier than usual. The morning was grey, typical for the northern city, but the light in her mind was incandescent. She bypassed the casual greetings of her early bird colleagues, her face a mask of deliberate neutrality. She was not grieving, she was optimizing. She walked straight to the large conference room, commandeered for the planning of the Trafford Power Station revitalization. It was the most complex and career-defining project of her decade-long tenure, transforming a colossal, decaying monument to industrial history into a state-of-the-art cultural and commercial hub. The project required the highest level of structural diplomacy, preserving the beautiful, failing Victorian brick shell while inserting a modern, seismically sound skeleton within. She sat alone at the massive oak table, surrounded by stacks of technical reports, stress test results, and three-dimensional models far larger and more detailed than the one she had ruined with yogurt back home. The reality of the power station was a welcome relief from the fragility of domestic life. Here, forces were measurable, reactions predictable, and failure modes diagnosable with absolute certainty. A beam was either strong enough or it wasn't. There was no, it's complicated. She didn't start with her usual meticulous review of the integration plans. Instead, she pulled up the failure analysis log for the original 1920s construction. She was searching for their mistakes, the errors of the men who had built it a century ago. She wanted to understand the historical fissures. She found it, a dense, archived report detailing a calculation error in the original foundation piles beneath the main turbine hall, an error that had been noted and compensated for, but never fully rectified. The original engineers had added a massive counterload block, a crude, enormous band-aid of concrete, to stabilize the failing section. The calculation they used was sound, but the execution was reactive. They had patched the structure instead of rebuilding the foundation. The legacy of fear, she thought, the diary entry from her mother echoing in her mind. They prioritized the appearance of stability over the reality of true soundness. Eleanor spent 4 uninterrupted hours meticulously recalculating the load distribution on the oldest section of the turbine hall's northern wall. Her focus was absolute, her concentration a physical weight, pressing down on the desk. She was not just calculating steel and concrete, she was channeling the entire pressure of her betrayal, her anger, and her inherited shame into the numbers. Every decimal point, every force vector, was a response to Alistair's pathetic voicemail. "You're destroying my career," she heard him whine. No, she was building hers, transforming the catastrophic energy of her personal life into professional perfection. By midday, her hypothesis was confirmed. The original counterload block, while effective for 80 years, was now, with the proposed modern usage loads, dangerously close to its critical stress ratio. The failure mode, if triggered, would be a catastrophic shearing of the primary load-bearing wall, an irreversible, nonlinear collapse. Patching was no longer an option. She didn't pause. She immediately drafted an internal memo to the senior partners and the chief structural team. The subject line was uncompromising, urgent, mandatory design revision, Trafford Power Station, North Wall Foundation, imminent failure. The body of the memo was concise, brutal, and backed by pages of fresh, irrefutable calculations. She proposed a solution that no one had dared to suggest: the full controlled demolition and immediate rebuild of the compromised northern foundation, rather than the proposed, cheaper, and structurally riskier stabilization plan. The demolition would be costly, would set the timeline back by 4 months, and would challenge the political will of the entire project board. But it was the only honest engineering solution. "We have identified a fundamental error in the original structure's foundation," she wrote, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "This is not a repair situation. It is a structural termination and reconstruction event. Any attempt to contain this failure through stabilization will result in a predictable, non-linear collapse under the projected load cycle. We must choose the painful, costly truth of demolition over the convenient, deceptive comfort of a patch job. The integrity of the entire project depends on the integrity of its absolute zero-point foundations." She signed the memo and hit send, feeling a fierce, cold satisfaction. She was not patching her life, and she would not patch the power station. The structure must be sound to its core, or it must be torn down and rebuilt. The choice was clear. Her colleague, Marcus Thorne, no relation to Alistair, but an ironic coincidence, Eleanor now noted with a dry internal chuckle. knocked tentatively on the doorframe. Marcus, usually cheerful and robust, looked wary. "Ellie, I got your memo. And your calc sheets. Are you all right? This is a pretty aggressive move, pulling the entire north wall. We've been planning stabilization for 6 months." Eleanor looked up, her expression calm, devoid of the familiar warmth Marcus was used to. "I am operating with a full, uncompromised understanding of the stress variables, Marcus. The proposed stabilization is based on the assumption of a compliant, passive structure. The reality is that the original foundation is corrosive. It is a slow-motion failure waiting for a trigger. You cannot build a future on a rotten base. We terminate the faulty element and rebuild it with verified materials. It is the only way to guarantee a 10-year lifespan, let alone 100. Marcus, a pragmatic, old-school engineer, finally nodded slowly. He wasn't convinced by her emotional state, but he was silenced by her numbers. "The calculations are flawless, Eleanor. You're right. But the political fallout, this is going to be a bloodbath with the project board." "Let them spill blood, Marcus," Eleanor replied, returning her attention to a new set of shear force diagrams. "I deal with physics, not politics. I have presented the truth. The board can choose to ignore the laws of physics, but they will have to sign off on the liability." "They won't." The conversation confirmed her new internal posture. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the accommodating wife, the silent enabler. She was Eleanor Vance, the unyielding engineer, the specialist in catastrophic failure management. The trauma of her divorce had sharpened her professional vision into a surgical instrument. The soft, forgiving edges of her personality, the ones that had allowed Alistair to manipulate her, had been ground down to a razor-sharp, absolute point. She saw the reflection of her journey in the power station. It was a beautiful, magnificent, broken thing, and it needed someone willing to be brutal to save it. She had spent her life trying to build things. Now she understood that her true gift was the courage to perform necessary demolition. Demolition was not destruction. It was a prerequisite for honest construction. Later that afternoon, she received a text from Sarah, her solicitor. It was brief and delivered the news with Sarah's signature dry humor. "Sarah, solicitor." The judge signed the motion. "Joint liquid assets frozen solid. The money he transferred to C. Davies has been flagged as dissipation of marital assets. His side is having a complete hilarious meltdown. His lawyer keeps referencing the trauma of the sudden lockout. I referenced the £3,000 transfer and the breach of fiduciary duty. I think they got the message, Ellie. You are officially in control of the perimeter." Eleanor read the text, a small, cold smile touching her lips. The trauma of the sudden lockout. Alistair's life, built on borrowed charm and subsidized stability, was experiencing the same non-linear collapse she had just mapped for the power station. He was feeling the consequences of his own structurally unsound choices. She deleted the text message and immediately pulled up her professional project management schedule. The conflict with Alistair was not a distraction. It was a training exercise. It had prepared her for the real war, the project board meeting scheduled for the next day, where she would have to defend her demolition plan. She realized that her personal trauma had provided her with a new, invaluable perspective. The cycle breaker's vision, the builder's vision, sees potential, focuses on integration and compromise, assumes good faith in the materials. The old Eleanor, who stayed silent for a decade. The cycle breaker's vision sees failure, focuses on risk analysis and containment, assumes corruption in the foundation until proven otherwise. The new Eleanor, who saw the rot and ordered the structure's immediate termination. She had inherited a cycle of silence and emotional avoidance from her mother. She had almost replicated it in her own marriage, choosing the shame of silence over the dignity of confrontation. But now, in the sterile, quantifiable world of structural engineering, she had found the vocabulary and the tools to break it. Her divorce was her final exam in integrity. She looked at the complex scaffolding diagrams for the power station, the intricate network of temporary supports required before the final controlled implosion of the north wall. She realized that the scaffolding was her current life, temporary, external, and absolutely necessary to support her, while the core failure was systematically removed and replaced with something honest. Eleanor worked until late into the night, fine-tuning the demolition sequence, calculating the precise amount of microcharges needed to bring down the old wall without compromising the surrounding Victorian façade. She felt no fatigue, only the steady, pure hum of utility. She had transformed the shame, the hurt, and the silent fury into a powerful, quantifiable force. Before leaving, she stopped at the office water cooler. A young junior engineer, newly graduated and full of nervous energy, approached her. "Miss Vance? I just read the North Wall memo. It's incredible. No one has ever dared to suggest demolition before. It's terrifying, but the numbers, they don't lie." Eleanor met the young man's eyes. She saw in them the clean slate of pure theoretical idealism, the same idealism she used to possess. "The numbers never lie," Eleanor confirmed, her voice low. "Only people do. Our job is not to make things look pretty or convenient. Our job is to manage load and consequence. If the foundation is based on a lie, you must tear it down. The only structure worth building is one that can bear the full, honest weight of reality." She walked out into the cool Manchester night, leaving the clean, honest world of her work behind. She drove home to her silent, empty house, now her fortress. The ghost of Alistair was gone, replaced by the reassuring geometry of her own discipline. She was no longer defined by the chaos of his failure, but by the rigor of her own reconstruction. Her new structure was built on zero, and zero was the strongest foundation of all. Tiep Teo La Hoi Tai, Fan 5. The project board meeting was held in the imposing, wood-paneled boardroom of the Vanguard Structural Headquarters. It was a space designed to exert weight and authority. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, facing 7 individuals, senior partners, financial directors, and the head of the Preservation Trust, all of whom represented the old guard, the cautious methodology, the fear of unnecessary cost and disruption. She wore a charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored, a deliberate uniform of unassailable professionalism. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She felt no nervousness, only a profound sense of purpose. This was not a presentation, it was a structural intervention. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, which Eleanor swiftly curtailed. The chairman, a stout man named Mr. Harrington, known for his relentless focus on the bottom line, cleared his throat. "Miss Vance, your memo regarding the north wall of the Trafford Power Station has, shall we say, caused some consternation. Your proposal to demolish and rebuild the entire foundation, rather than proceed with the established stabilization plan, represents a significant deviation from the approved budget and timeline. We are talking about an extra 4 months and nearly £3 million. Can you justify this extreme measure?" Eleanor did not mush. She clicked the remote, and the massive projection screen behind her displayed a single, simple diagram, a cross-section of the power station's foundation. The original faulty foundation pile was highlighted in a terrifying, aggressive red. "I can, Mr. Harrington. I will not appeal to emotion or convenience. I will appeal only to the immutable laws of physics and the professional integrity of this firm," she began, her voice low, amplified slightly by the room's acoustics, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "For 6 months, we planned a stabilization strategy, a patch job, if you will. The original engineers in the 1920s identified a load-bearing deficiency and corrected it reactively with a counterload block. This was a patch, and like all patches, it was a short-term solution that disguised a fundamental weakness. My recent calculations confirm that with the new, higher load requirements for the cultural hub, the human traffic, the internal steel framework, the weight of the new performance stages, that patch will not hold." She clicked the remote again. The screen shifted to a complex, 3-dimensional simulation of the failure mode. It was brutal and swift. The red foundation pile buckled. The northern wall sheared and crumbled inward in a cascade of virtual dust and collapsing brick. "This is a non-linear collapse, gentlemen. It is unpredictable in timing, but absolute in consequence. The existing structure has reached its critical stress ratio. Any additional structural dishonesty, any attempt to simply reinforce the façade without addressing the foundational lie, will result in this scenario. We would not be dealing with a repair. We would be dealing with a disaster, costing not 3 million but hundreds of millions in liability, reputational damage, and, potentially, loss of life." Mr. Harrington leaned forward, his face etched with financial anxiety. "But what about the political optics, Miss Vance? The Preservation Trust is vehemently against demolition. They call it architectural vandalism. The Preservation Trust, with all due respect, deals in aesthetics and history, not structural physics. Their demand for preservation is based on the appearance of the structure. My professional responsibility is to the reality of the structure. I ask you, which is the greater vandalism? The controlled, ethical demolition of a known failing element to ensure the longevity of the whole, or the silent, willful ignorance of a deadly flaw to maintain a convenient timeline? Eleanor paused, letting the silence settle, a controlled, strategic silence, utterly unlike the passive silence of her mother. This silence was a weapon. My mother taught me that sometimes people tolerate structural dishonesty because they are afraid of the chaos of change. They live with the rot because the work required to remove it is too painful or too costly. I refuse to apply that flawed philosophy to a project that will define the city for the next century. She spoke about the project, but every word was a direct reflection of her divorce. Foundational dishonesty. The painful, costly truth of demolition, refusing to live with the rot. The power station was her manifesto. Another senior partner, Mr. Davison, challenged her on the cost. £3 million is a substantial expenditure, Eleanor. Can we not simply bore new piles alongside the existing ones and distribute the load? That would halve the cost and time. Eleanor smiled, a tight, professional movement of her lips that carried no warmth. You are proposing to patch a patch, Mr. Davison. When a structure is compromised, you must return to absolute zero. If we bore new piles, we are still relying on the stability of the surrounding, weakened Victorian brick to support the transition. We are still choosing a calculated risk over an absolute certainty. The only way to guarantee a structure is to remove the corrupt element completely, verify the ground beneath, and rebuild with materials certified for the new load requirements. The original foundation is a known flaw. We must terminate it. She clicked the remote one last time. The screen showed a simplified, elegant rendering of her proposed reconstruction. A new, deep concrete slab, reinforced with modern steel, designed to outlast the power station itself. It was clean, honest, and utterly unromantic. I have signed off on the liability for this proposal. I guarantee its performance for 100 years. If you choose the stabilization plan, you are signing off on the liability for a predictable, non-linear failure. The choice is yours. The numbers do not lie, and neither do I. The boardroom was silent again. The senior partners exchanged uneasy glances. They were men who understood risk, and Eleanor had stripped away every layer of mitigation except for two raw, terrifying choices: pay the money for the truth, or risk catastrophic failure for the sake of convenience. Mr. Harrington tapped his pen on the table twice. He looked at Eleanor, not with frustration, but with a sudden, grudging respect. He saw the cold, unyielding precision of her mind. He saw a professional who had calculated the ultimate cost of dishonesty. Very well, Miss Vance. Your confidence is persuasive, and your numbers are, as always, unassailable. We will present your full demolition and rebuild plan to the board of directors next week. Prepare the full structural termination sequence, including the detailed micro-charge placement plan. You will oversee this phase personally. The meeting concluded with a cold, swift resolution. Eleanor packed her materials, her heart beating with a steady, quiet rhythm of victory. She had prevailed, not by being aggressive, but by being the ultimate source of irrefutable truth. She had used the emotional energy of her divorce, the need to never again be lied to or ignored, to push through the only correct, if painful, engineering solution. As she walked out of the boardroom, Marcus caught up with her, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. Ellie, that was ruthless. I've never seen you argue with that level of certainty. You almost sounded like you were enjoying the idea of the demolition. Eleanor paused by the elevator, looking him directly in the eye. Her voice was soft, but the meaning was steel. I am enjoying the fact that for the first time in a long time, I am building something on an honest foundation, Marcus. And sometimes, the only way to get to that honesty is by tearing down the lie. My true strength is not in building. It is in recognizing what must be destroyed. She stepped into the elevator, leaving Marcus standing there, contemplating her words. Later that evening, the text arrived from Alistair. His lawyer had obviously briefed him on the freezing order, and he was panicking, trying a different tack. Alistair, Ellie, I've had time to think. I know I screwed up, terribly, but I still love you, and I miss the structure we had. I'm lost without you. I need my architect back. Eleanor read the message on her phone screen. I need my architect back. Not, I miss you. Not, I regret the pain I caused. But I need the structure you provided. It was the final confirmation of his parasitic dependency. She didn't respond. She simply blocked his number. The perimeter was now completely secured. She was no longer his architect. She was the one who had signed the demolition order for the structure she realized she had built entirely alone. The cycle of silence and enabling was definitively broken. The morning of the demolition was also the morning Eleanor began to design her new house. It felt appropriate, a controlled symmetry in her life, the intentional destruction of the old lie in the public sphere, and the rigorous planning of the new truth in the private one. She sat at her drafting table. The ruined yogurt-covered power station model finally cleared away, replaced by clean, vast sheets of tracing paper. This new house would not be the sprawling, glass and wood monstrosity she had designed for Alistair in the Cotswolds, a structure full of empty spaces for his ego and his unused photography studio. This house would be small, compact, and perfectly functional. It was to be built not for compromise, but for necessity. She chose a small, rugged plot of land near the Peak District National Park, far enough from the urban sprawl of Manchester to feel solitary, but close enough to commute to her work. The design was brutalist, minimalist, and absolutely honest. Concrete, wood, and steel. No unnecessary decorative elements. Every window would frame a specific view of the rugged, unforgiving landscape, forcing the inhabitant to constantly acknowledge the raw, external reality. The interior walls would be structural, load-bearing, and non-negotiable. She started with the foundation, a deep, single-slab concrete base, designed to withstand any local earth shift. She drew the plans with a steady hand, feeling the profound difference in her intent. The Cotswolds house was an apology. This one was a statement. The Cotswolds house was built for two people, only one of whom truly existed. This house was built for one, with zero expectation of compromise. There was no master bedroom. There was only a single, compact sleeping area with a large, low window that faced east, designed to force her to greet the sunrise, to confront the start of every day. She did not design a massive, open-plan kitchen for entertaining. She designed a galley kitchen, efficient, precise, and intended for the solitary preparation of food. There were no grand gestures, only efficient geometry. She called the project the Anchor. As she finished the initial structural sketches, the clock neared 10 o'clock, the scheduled time for the controlled implosion of the power station's north wall. She had requested to be the one to press the final detonation button. It was a symbolic act she needed to perform, a final, physical exorcism of the weakness she had allowed to exist. She drove to the power station site. It was a cold, bright, clear day, perfect for demolition, perfect for visibility. The site was secured, the perimeter clear, and the atmosphere tense. She was directed to the command bunker, a temporary control room set up hundreds of yards from the main structure. Marcus and the chief demolition crew were already inside, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of monitoring screens. Marcus, his hands slightly shaking, handed her a small, metallic box with a single, large, red button protected by a clear plastic shield. The final sequence is armed, Ellie. All clearance reports are green. The microcharges are set. You have 10 minutes to commencement. Eleanor took the box. It was surprisingly light. The weight of her decision was not in the device, but in the certainty of her heart. She looked at the live feed on the largest monitor. The power station was majestic, even in its state of decay. And the north wall, the one with the rotten foundation, was covered in a network of red wires leading to the precisely calculated charges she had designed. Marcus spoke, his voice low. It's a magnificent structure, Eleanor. It's hard to watch a piece of history go. History must sometimes be destroyed to ensure the future, Marcus, she replied, her gaze fixed on the screen. The structure looks sound from this distance, doesn't it? That's the deception. It only looks whole because the external forces haven't yet reached their maximum load. But the rot is there. We are simply expediting a predictable outcome. We are choosing the timing of the collapse, rather than letting chaos choose it for us. She stepped up to the radio and spoke to the site foreman, her voice steady. This is Eleanor Vance. Commence countdown sequence. 10 minutes to detonation. As the digital clock on the monitor ticked down, Eleanor's mind drifted, a final, rapid review of her entire life, condensed into the next few moments. She thought of her mother, Martha, living for years in the silence, protecting the façade of a marriage that was already dust. She chose the slow collapse. I choose the swift, clean break. She thought of Alistair's final, desperate text. I need my architect back. His need was built on the assumption that she would always prioritize his convenience over her own truth. I am no longer your architect, Alistair. I am the demolition expert. She thought of the thousands of lines she had drawn for the beautiful, false dream house in the Cotswolds. Now just shredded paper in a landfill. Every beautiful lie must eventually be accounted for. The announcer's voice crackled over the radio, counting down the seconds, in a calm, practiced monotone. T-minus 60 seconds. Eleanor placed the small detonation box on the console table in front of her. She looked at the red button, framed by the plastic shield. It was the physical expression of her ultimate decision. The decision to end the cycle of silence. The decision to prioritize truth over convenience. T-minus 10 seconds. She raised her hand, her movements deliberate and slow. She reached for the shield, her fingers brushing the cold plastic. The entire room held its breath. 5, 4, 3. She flipped the shield open. The red button pulsed menacingly in the sterile light. 2. Her index finger descended, resting lightly on the button's cool surface. 1. She pressed the button. There was no immediate, world-shattering roar. Instead, there was a series of quick, sharp, precise, crack, crack, crack sounds. The controlled detonation of the microcharges. These were followed by a strange, low, groaning sound, the sound of a century-old structure finally conceding to physics. On the screen, the north wall did not explode outward. It simply sighed, the brickwork separating cleanly at the base. And then it fell inward in a spectacular, cascading rush of red dust, pulverized concrete, and shattered steel. The collapse was contained, perfect and absolute. The foundation failed exactly as predicted. A silent, colossal plume of red-brown dust rose majestically into the clear Manchester sky, looking exactly like the yolk of a broken egg spreading across the atmosphere. The control room erupted in a sudden roar of nervous, triumphant cheers. Marcus slapped his thigh and shook his head, a stunned smile on his face. My God, Eleanor! Textbook. Absolutely textbook. It was like watching a perfectly executed cut. Eleanor felt the distant tremor of the collapse in her feet. She did not cheer. She stood motionless, watching the screen, watching the dust settle. The wall was gone. The core structural dishonesty was removed. The new structure could now begin. She felt a profound, aching relief. A clean, empty space in her chest where the sustained, anxious pressure of the marriage had resided for years. The pain was still there, but it was no longer the pain of a slow, corrosive infection. It was the clean, healthy pain of a surgical wound. She spoke into the suddenly quieted room, her voice carrying an authority that was new and absolute. Containment team, move in. Begin debris removal immediately. I want the ground cleared for pile driving by first light tomorrow. She turned to Marcus, handing him the detonation box. The demolition phase is complete, Marcus. Now, the reconstruction begins. She left the command bunker without looking back, the roar of the cleanup crew's machinery already starting behind her. She did not stop for coffee. She drove straight back to her home, her fortress. She walked back into her silent study, sat down at her drafting table, and immediately started applying load calculations to the foundation of her new home, the anchor. She needed to know the structure she was building for herself could bear the full, uncompromised weight of her own truth. And she did not want a light structure. She wanted a heavy, honest, resilient one. That evening, the divorce papers arrived via email from Sarah. They were clean, concise, and heavily favored Eleanor, leveraging Alistair's financial misconduct to secure her position in the house and the majority of the liquid assets, the money he had almost stolen. It was justice, precise and engineered. The final page required her signature. She didn't hesitate. She printed the document, picked up her pen, and signed her name, Eleanor Vance. The signature was firm, bold, and entirely her own. She was no longer Eleanor Vance Thorne. She packaged the signed papers, ready to send back to Sarah. As she looked at the document, A sudden, surprising thought struck her. She realized she owed Alistair nothing, not even her anger. He had been the catalyst. He had been the stress test that revealed the catastrophic weakness in her inherited coping mechanism. He had been the force that required the demolition. She hadn't saved her marriage, but she had saved herself from becoming her mother. The signed divorce papers were sealed and sent to Sarah. The destruction of the north wall had been perfectly contained. Eleanor was ready to move into the full-scale reconstruction phase. Yet one small, human anomaly remained in her failure analysis log. Chloe, the young art student, was not an object of her hatred, but a final piece of data required for a complete forensic report on Alistair's predatory pattern. Eleanor needed to understand the environment of his betrayal, not for vengeance, but for ultimate clarity. Using the small amount of information she had, the art school and her first name, Eleanor managed to track Chloe Davies down to a quiet, anonymous cafe near the Chelsea College of Arts in London. Eleanor didn't approach the meeting with anger. She approached it with the disciplined curiosity of a scientist observing a control variable. She was there to analyze the nature of the rot, not to contain the symptom. Eleanor arrived precisely at 3 o'clock. She wore the same sensible navy coat she had worn on the day of the discovery. She wanted Chloe to recognize the image of the wife she had displaced. But she also wanted to project an aura of unshakable, non-threatening, professional calm. Chloe was already sitting at a small table by the window, nervously nursing a half-empty cup of herbal tea. She was younger, thinner, and more fragile than Eleanor remembered. Her bleached blonde hair was messier, and her eyes, though still wide and beautiful, were shadowed with palpable anxiety. She looked up as Eleanor approached, her face instantly draining of color. She was expecting a battlefield. Eleanor pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down without asking. She did not offer a greeting. "Chloe Davies?" Chloe nodded, unable to speak, her hands gripping the porcelain mug tightly. "I am Eleanor Vance, Alistair's soon-to-be ex-wife. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Chloe finally found her voice. A small, breathless whisper. I thought you were sending lawyers. He said you were a structural engineer, very ruthless. I didn't know what you wanted. I am ruthless only with dishonesty, Chloe, and I am not here as a wife or a lawyer. I am here as an analyst. I want to understand the structure of the lie he built, and I wanted to ensure that the damage stops with my generation. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, resting her hands flat on the table. "You met him through his work, I presume. Did he tell you about me?" Chloe hesitated, then nodded rapidly, driven by the pressure of Eleanor's steady gaze. "He said you were his anchor, his structural foundation, but he said that foundation was stifling him, that you were too rigid, too logical. He said he was an artist, and you were trying to fit him into a spreadsheet. He needed space to breathe. He needed a muse." Eleanor absorbed the information, her mind filing it under Alistair's pattern. The victim narrative. He hadn't just cheated. He had carefully constructed a story that absolved him of responsibility, turning Eleanor's strength into his justification. The structural engineer who was destroying the artist, Eleanor noted, a small, dry smile finally appearing. That is a beautifully concise piece of deflection, even for him. "And did he tell you about the financial arrangement? The £3,000 he transferred to you 6 weeks ago, labeled emergency rent?" Chloe flinched violently, her eyes widening in shame and alarm. He promised he would give me that. I was having trouble with my landlord. He said it was an investment in my future, in my art. He said he had plenty, and that you were the one who kept it locked up and inaccessible. He framed it as his rebellion." Eleanor nodded. "I saw the transaction. I froze the accounts and flagged the transfer as dissipation of marital assets. That is what prompted his lawyer's involvement. And I believe, Chloe, that when he realized the accounts were frozen, he quickly withdrew his investment from you, correct?" Chloe's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, biting her lip to stifle a sob. "He called me 3 days ago, said the bank flagged it as fraudulent, and I had to send the money back immediately, or we'd both be arrested. He panicked. He took it all back. I'm going to lose my flat. He said you were trying to destroy him, that you were doing this out of spite." Eleanor felt a sudden, profound calm. The narrative was complete. Chloe was not the malicious other woman. She was a victim, a financially desperate 22-year-old artist who was a perfect, vulnerable target for Alistair's financial and emotional manipulation. He hadn't just used his wife's money, he had used a third party's vulnerability as a temporary savings account, betraying both women simultaneously. He is a structural parasite, Chloe. He doesn't need a muse. He needs an infrastructure, either one he can rely on completely or one he can drain completely. I was the reliable one, you were the drainable one. The shame is not yours. The shame is his. You are not a homewrecker. You are a symptom of his deep structural insecurity. Chloe watched her, tears now running freely down her face, stunned by the cold, analytical diagnosis. Why are you telling me this? To scare me? No, I'm telling you this because I want to ensure the damage stops with my generation. My own mother stayed silent about my father's betrayal and lived in a failing structure for 10 years, hoping it would protect me. It didn't. It taught me to be silent and to enable men like Alistair. That silence ends now, and that pattern will not be passed on to you. Eleanor reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. She placed it on the table. This is not an apology. This is an ethical remediation. The £3,000 you received was money that legally belonged to me. The shame of being forced to return it under false pretenses is not a load you should have to bear. What is this? Chloe asked, her voice trembling. It is a bank draft, drawn from my personal, separate account, for £3,000. It is entirely anonymous, filed under a consulting fee, managed by my solicitor. It is not tied to Alistair in any way. It is the real rent money he promised you. Use it to pay your landlord. I am paying for the demolition of the lie, Chloe. I am paying for the structural honesty he was incapable of providing. Chloe stared at the envelope, then back at Eleanor, her eyes wide with incomprehension. You're giving me the money? After what happened? I am not giving it to you because you deserve it, or because I forgive him. I am giving it to you because I refuse to allow Alistair's deception to propagate further damage into a younger generation. You are 22. You need to build your own life on an honest foundation. You need to learn that men who promise to save you with borrowed money are men who will always collapse the structure you rely on. Do not let his failure become your burden. The cycle stops here. Eleanor stood up, adjusting the collar of her navy coat. She felt nothing towards Chloe. No resentment, no sympathy, just a profound clinical satisfaction that she had terminated the structural weakness in her own lineage. She had proactively prevented Chloe from becoming another Martha, trapped in a structure of silent, subsidized pain. If he contacts you again, Chloe, I advise you to change your number immediately. He is a non-essential element. Terminate the connection. Focus on building your own, non-negotiable life. The only structure you can ever truly rely on is the one you build for yourself. Eleanor turned and walked away. She didn't look back. The moment she stepped out of the cafe and into the busy London street, she felt the final, definitive release. The last loose variable in her failure analysis was resolved. She had not only demolished the structure Alistair had occupied, but she had also ensured that the debris would not harm the next person who stumbled into his path. She walked towards the tube station. The vast, complex, engineered structure of the city's transport network surrounding her. She felt a profound sense of integration. She was a functional, essential part of a massive, honest infrastructure. The feeling was not happiness, but something far more durable, solidity. She thought of the divorce papers, the demolition at the power station, the plans for the anchor. Every action, once painful, now felt like a perfect calculation. She had achieved the core goal of her personal reconstruction, to break the inherited cycle of silence and enabling. She had chosen confrontation over concealment, rigor over romance, and the costly truth over the convenient lie. The drive back to Manchester from London felt vastly different from the agonizing journey 2 weeks prior. There was no longer the oppressive weight of a crumbling structure or the frantic, cold calculation of denial. Now, there was only the clean, straight line of purpose. Eleanor drove with the radio on, a low, melodic jazz station, allowing the sound to fill the car, a sound that she herself had chosen, not one that had been chosen for her by the ghost of a husband. She felt neither grief nor euphoria, but a deep, immense solidity. She arrived home late in the evening. The house was exactly as she had left it, orderly, sterile, and entirely purged of Alistair's chaotic presence. It was no longer a beautiful stage set for a failed performance. It was a fortress, her operational base. She went straight to the study, not to work, but to perform a final inspection of her personal structure. She pulled out the final set of drawings for The Anchor, her new home in the Peak District. The design was complete. The calculations verified. It was a single-story structure, compact and low-slung, blending into the rugged landscape. She had meticulously designed every element: the thick, reinforced concrete shear walls, the deep pile foundation, the single, unyielding structural column in the center. The central column was not symbolic of a shared life. It was symbolic of her singular strength, designed to bear the entire load of the roof structure alone. As she reviewed the final blueprint, she noticed a detail she had subconsciously included. The main entrance door was designed to be unusually heavy, requiring a deliberate, firm push to open. It was a physical, daily reminder of her ultimate lesson. Entry into her life would never again be casual, and the foundation she stood on would never be light or easily compromised. She printed the final architectural drawings. The thick, creamy paper was cool to the touch, carrying the absolute truth of physics and geometry. This was the structure that would not lie to her. A text message blinked on her phone from Sarah, the solicitor. The divorce was moving rapidly and cleanly, exactly as engineered. Sarah, solicitor. Papers processed. Alistair signed without contest. He was far too distracted by the asset freeze and the urgent need to secure new investors. Finalized decree absolute will be issued in 6 weeks. I also have an interesting piece of collateral data for your file. I heard through the legal network that Alistair is launching a new documentary project. It's titled The Weight of Structure, and is apparently about the stifling nature of bourgeois commitment and how the collapse of his marriage liberated his art. He's already pitching for funding. Eleanor read the text twice. She felt a profound, final quietness settle over her. The weight of structure. Alistair had taken the precise language of her pain, the exact vocabulary of her structural analysis, and twisted it into his new artistic excuse. He had used her trauma as his latest, most lucrative funding proposal. He was incapable of absorbing a lesson. He could only monetize a situation. He hadn't changed, and he never would. He had merely found a new way to exploit the stability she had provided, even in its destruction. She put the phone down, not with anger, but with an immense, liberating clarity. She owed him nothing, not even the satisfaction of her remaining fury. His existence was now simply a data point, a confirmed structural failure mode. She had ensured 2 things. She would never again provide him with a foundation, and the collateral damage of his failure, Chloe, had been contained and redirected toward honest construction. The primary mission was complete. 6 months later, the wind in the Peak District was cold, sharp, and smelling of damp peat and rain-washed stone. The landscape was brutal, beautiful, and utterly honest. Eleanor stood on the finished concrete slab of the Anchor's foundation, looking out over the rolling, unforgiving hills. The foundation was immense, heavy, and perfect, ready for the frame to rise next week. She was wearing thick work boots, jeans stained with concrete dust, and a heavy, dark green jacket. She looked less like the pristine Manchester engineer of a year ago, and more like a woman who dealt directly with the harsh reality of the earth. She had driven up immediately after leaving the completed Trafford power station site. The revitalization project had been a roaring success. The demolition and rebuild of the North Wall, once controversial, was now lauded as a triumph of ethical engineering. She had received a major promotion and a substantial bonus. She had built a great, lasting structure for her city, a structure that would hold. Now, she stood on her own structure, built for one, built for truth. She crouched down and ran her hand over the rough, cold concrete surface of the foundation. It was the absolute 0 point of her life. It bore no history of compromise, no ghost of betrayal, only the verified strength of its materials. She began to speak, her voice low against the rushing wind, not to an audience, but to the structure beneath her feet. The final monologue of her deliverance. They say that a foundation is meant to hold the weight of the house. That's only half the truth. A foundation is meant to bear the load of reality. I thought I was strong because I could carry Alistair's weight, the weight of his chaos, his irresponsibility, his lies. She stood up slowly, looking out at the uncompromising horizon. That wasn't strength. That was accommodation. That was my mother's legacy, the silent contract that trades your truth for a false security. The belief that disruption is the ultimate failure. I lived in a structure that was already dust, held together only by my shame and my tireless labor. A raw, genuine smile finally touched her lips. Not the tight, controlled smile of the old Eleanor, but a smile born of hard-won truth. He asked me, "Why didn't you call?" That was the final clue. He saw me as a security system, not a wife. And I realized I had become exactly that, a function, not a person. She paused, feeling the cold air fill her lungs, a coldness that felt clean, honest. I couldn't stop him from betraying me. I couldn't stop my father from betraying my mother. That is the nature of human weakness, a variable we cannot control. But I found my power in the aftermath. My power was the refusal to continue the inherited silence. I broke the cycle. I spoke the truth to my mother, freeing her from her decade of quiet shame. I spoke the truth to Chloe, refusing to allow her to become the next subsidized victim, stopping the damage from spreading to the next generation. I spoke the truth to the entire project board, choosing the painful, costly demolition over the convenient, cheap lie. And that is the only structure that holds, the structure of your own integrity. You cannot build a house on a weak man's promises. You can only build a life on the unyielding concrete of your own self-respect. She turned, her eyes sweeping across the raw, immense beauty of the Peak District. The sky was darkening, turning to a deep, intense blue. She felt small against the vastness of the land, but powerfully centered. Some walls don't collapse. They simply reveal they were never holding anything. My marriage wasn't destroyed by the explosion of a secret. It was destroyed by the quiet, slow realization that I was living alone in a house I had built entirely for someone else. Now I am standing on ground that is mine. Ground that is honest. Ground that is ready. She pulled her thick collar up against the wind. The silence around her was not the oppressive, fearful silence of her mother's suffering. It was the heavy, deep, reassuring silence of a foundation that is finally, irrevocably sound. The reconstruction had begun.